the National Organizing Manager for the Secular Student Alliance and Humanist Chaplain at the University of Southern California. He spent almost 20 years in congressional pastoral ministry before leaving his church in 2013. In 2014, he spent a year examining his religious and spiritual beliefs, exploring atheism, and writing about his experience in his blog, Year Without God. He's a host of the podcast, Life After God, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, CNN, Time, The Humanist, and Pathos. Here is Learning to Live Without Promises with Ryan Bell.
I think I have never been to Wisconsin, so I'm checking off one more state on my list. And I just have to say publicly how amazing I thought Sophia's presentation is. She spoke and performed at last year's Secular Student Alliance Conference in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm so glad that the leaders here grabbed you and brought you here. I think it was Ian last night that was saying that we need more art in this movement, and I think he's absolutely right, and there it is. So, well done. Yeah, it's terrible to have to follow that, though, because this is not going to be in any way a performance along those lines. I do want to give, I think this is a little hot. It's like ringing back at me a little bit. I want to give a quick content advisory for my talk. There will be frequent use of words like should, must, and ought. And by those words, I mean that these are my thoughts, my opinions, and you are free to disagree with them. But this talk is somewhat polemical, a little bit like a manifesto. So I just want you to know that sort of going in. There's a hymn that I used to sing growing up in the church that I want to share with you, and you've probably heard it if you grew up in the church at all, and even if you haven't. And I want you to try to forget everything you know, which is, of course, impossible, but forget everything you know about religion. Pretend like you're just coming to this song for the first time, and pay attention to what it evokes in you. And if that doesn't work, pay attention to what you think the song is supposed to invoke in you, a feeling that you're supposed to have. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning on the everlasting arms. And then the final stanza says, what have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. What do you think? How do you feel about that, those words? What does it bring up for you? Lean not on your own. I'm just going to repeat what he's saying so we get it for the recording. Yeah, so he's saying like the idea in Proverbs of lean not on your own understanding. Anything else? What does it make you feel? Cozy. How else does it make you feel? Protected. Oh. Okay, yeah, that's true. That's true. And if you Wikipedia the song, what I learned is you'll see all the pop culture references to this song on Wikipedia. Anybody else before we move on? How does it make you feel? I feel like I'm a therapist. How does that make you feel? Childlike. Okay. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? So this song is meant to make you feel safe and secure, right? Safe, and in fact, it literally says, safe and secure from all alarms. And it says, what have I to dread? What have I to fear? I'm leaning on the everlasting arms. There's this text in the Hebrew Bible about God's people leaning on him. on his everlasting arms. You know, you kind of get the picture of this strong provider, like a father, right? Or a strong mother, someone that you run to, someone that's protecting you, keeping you safe. This is the essential promise of Christianity. It's rooted in the promise of eternal life with God in an earth made new, or heaven, depending on your theology. And the basic element of this promise is that you cannot die, that you will not die, that even if you die, you will not die. In the end, if you're on God's side, you will live forever. Not just you, everyone who places their trust in God receives God's offer of salvation. And not just that, but all evil, all corruption, all bad things in the universe will be eliminated forever. Even death itself, the Bible says, is the final enemy that will be destroyed. So that's the promise, right? That it's all going to be taken care of. According to the story, at some point in the relatively near future, God will return to earth and will destroy all the stubbornly unrepentant people, not so much by his wrath, but by the brightness of his goodness, right? You see the subtle difference there? And it's sort of like a vampire in the daylight, you know, it's like it's killed by the light, like a disinfectant, if you will. And, long story short, God destroys the earth by fire and then creates a new one in its place where all evil and all people that cling to evil will be destroyed as well, and we'll have a perfect, harmonious planet the way that it was originally intended to be, right? Back to Eden. Kind of a good sort of literary sort of coming back to the beginning. So this is the core promise of the Christian story. Eternal life in an earth made new, in a perfect world where nothing can go wrong. And embedded within that promise are a host of other smaller promises that make up that one big promise. One of those is that nothing truly bad can happen to you. Nothing can harm you. You may die. You may be even be tortured and subjected to all manner of horrible things. But even that is not truly harming you, because in the end, you will be okay. You'll be redeemed. You'll be saved. You'll be brought back to life. Even these horrible things that we can imagine happening to us cannot harm you. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus gathers his 12 disciples to him and gives them some instructions before he sends them out to evangelize in the hillsides of Galilee. And he says to them, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." And a few sentences later, Jesus continues and says, "Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." Those are the kinds of verses that we spent like hours and hours in seminary like poring over, because it's like a subtle wisdom, right? That you can kind of like I don't want to spoil it. Let it sit on you like if that were true, that would be such good news, right? Dallas Willard is the late USC philosopher and an evangelical Christian, an important voice in my theological formation and that of my cohorts. And one of his thoughts that I embraced so deeply was that in the kingdom of God, no harm can come to you. So that's one promise. Another promise, another corollary of the big promises, of the big overall promise of eternal life, is that in spite of appearances, everything is going to be okay. Right? Not just individual believers, which was my previous one, but this one is beyond that. The whole social order will be okay. Everything's going to be okay. Martin Luther King Jr. captured this philosophy succinctly when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's pretty clear from Dr. King's life that he did not believe that arc just sort of magically bends, but that we must participate in some way in bending it. But behind it is still this promise that it will bend, right, towards justice. It may be long, he says. The arc of the universe may be long, and it's sort of like the curvature of the earth. You know, people that believe in a flat earth, they think it's flat because they look and they go, "Look, it's flat." And they're deceived by the distance that they're comprehending with their eyes. If you step back far enough, you will see that the arc of the universe will bend, right? And we have this reassurance that it will bend. behind that aphorism is this fail-safe. Another popular aphorism that I used to love, often attributed to John Lennon, a character quite different than MLK, is that if everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Right? What a wonderful kind of truism if it were true, right? I'm not saying it is or it isn't yet. I'm just thinking, like, and I'm sure you have an opinion about it. But it's a great self-reassuring kind of comment. Everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Keep going. And what I came to conclude was that these are false promises, right? They're false promises. And what's the problem with believing a false promise? Well, you could end up at the end and not be okay, right? Or a bunch of other people could end up not okay because we were relying on something that wasn't really there. When it happens that you discover that there's no God, the promises that are made by God become very problematic, right? Because there is no more promise giver, or as we sometimes used to say, promise keeper. The promise maker isn't there. And I've spoken dozens of times over the last 5 years about my own discovery. First, this suspicion that I had that there wasn't a God, and finally my conclusion that there is not a God. And I've talked about that until I'm tired of hearing myself talk about it. And lately my focus has shifted quite a bit. In some ways back to what my original emphasis was in my work as a pastor. As stubbornly resilient as theism is, my contention is that atheism is a surprisingly, startlingly simple conclusion about one basic idea, right? And there are many paths to it. As many people as there are, everybody has a little slightly different story, but there's about 5 or 6 major ways that people become atheists. They are either through science, through philosophy, through anthropology, through psychology, or just their own simple personal experience where they said, I tried it and it didn't work. Or I leaned on those promises and they didn't hold me, right? It doesn't have to be super scientific or complicated. It can simply be, this thing didn't work for me. Sort of like the American dream, you kind of lean on that and it collapses and you're like, this is stupid, right? Sort of like that. I want to be able to make the move then from understanding the fatal flaws of theism to acting in line with those discoveries. Because if it's a simple discovery, we don't need necessarily to spend the rest of our lives like parsing it to the nth degree. We can simply move on and begin to act in line with the discovery that we've made, that there is no God, there are no promises. And the reason I bring this up is, well, before I do that, let me say that we often compare finding out there's no God with finding out there's no something else, like Santa Claus, right? And it's hard to use that analogy with Christians because it's very dismissive and condescending, but there is a lot of truth to it, right? And I think the reason that discovering Santa Claus is not real is so much easier than discovering that God is not real is that Santa Claus is not woven into every aspect of your life, right? Santa Claus was never woven into every aspect of your life. Yes, I cried. I was deeply distraught about the discovery that there was no Santa Claus for about 4 hours. And then I moved on, right? I don't remember if it was exactly 4 hours because I was about 6, but I suspect it was about 4 hours because I remember being in the back seat of my parents' car, and the sun was up, so it had to have been daytime. And by the evening, I don't have any memory of like crying myself to sleep or anything like that. So, but I do remember being shocked that there was no Santa Claus and distraught, and I wept. And I don't know whether I wept because there was no Santa Claus or I wept because my parents were lying to me or both. I don't know. I was too young to process all that, or at least I'm now too old to remember. But I was, I was upset for about half a day, and then I got over it, and I never went to any conferences for people who don't believe in Santa. I didn't seek a therapist to help me to deconvert from Santaism, because Santa literally doesn't matter, right? Santa doesn't matter. In fact, if you come back around to it, it's kind of a nice story. We always told our kids, it's funny, I always tell people, in spite of the fact that I was a pastor and believed in God, I didn't tell my kids that Santa was real. In fact, I told my kids that Santa was a great legend a great story about generosity. I left out the part about, being harsh to people that have been, made mistakes or whatever. So I told my kids a myth about Santa Claus, and I said, just don't tell your friends at school, because their parents will be really mad at us. But God is different. God is everything. God is important for this conversation. God is truth. It's not just that God conveys truth or God gives us truth. It's that God is truth, right? And God is truth in God's self. And the Bible poorly reflects that truth. But the truth of God is bigger than any book, any human mouthpiece. God is all and in all, according to the Apostle Paul. And because of this, I want to argue that atheism does have a moral valence to it. I know sometimes we get into these arguments where we say, well, atheism doesn't imply anything. It's just a belief that there is no God. Or even less than that, a lack of belief that there is a God, right? Sort of the soft version of atheism. So I want to say that not only do I not believe that there's a God, but I believe that there's a moral valence, a moral charge, a moral implication to this idea that there is no God. And the basic outline of my argument is as follows. The God hypothesis includes the claim that all goodness is rooted in God, but there is no God. And the absence of evidence for God is so overwhelming and devastating that I feel confident in saying I believe there is no God, not just that I lack belief in a God. No one is coming to save us. There are no promises. There are no guarantees. Also, goodness exists, and there are things that are objectively good and things that are objectively bad and wrong, and that conscious, sentient life is good and preferable to death, all things being equal. Therefore, we should take care of conscious and sentient life. Moreover, we should take care of the environments and resources necessary for the flourishing of life, both the natural and built environments. That's essentially what I want to say. If there is no God, and if goodness exists, and if what is good should be cared for and what is bad should be resisted or eliminated, then we who do not believe in God are responsible for each other. We are ethically bound to one another. We need to act in ways that make for human and other flourishing. As an aside, I think that deep sense of community that we all long for, that we keep talking about at all of these conferences, that deep sense of connection and belonging and community that's sort of like slips through our fingers like water, that community only really happens when we admit and realize that our lives are connected to each other in this way, right? If I'm an atomized individual here and you're an individual there and we're all just a collection of individuals who have no bearing on each other's lives, it's very difficult to create, if not impossible, to create community out of that. Because I don't care about you, and you don't care about me. Literally you, I don't care about you. But if we realize that our lives are dependent on one another in small and large ways, then we can begin to sense that we need each other. And that needing each other doesn't have to be a kind of codependent, weird, creepy thing, but can be a life-giving thing. Now I have to find where I was in my notes. Here we go. So atheism, for me, and I would offer to you, means waking up to this reality. It means getting sober, right? Marx called religion the opiate of the people because it meant that it was anesthetizing people to the sense of their own needs and their own power and their own control over their lives, right? It was to say, there's problems in your life, but don't worry, because everything's going to be okay. Like, you could, resist, and you could fight back, and you could, take up arms if necessary, but don't bother, because, God's got it under control. God's got the whole world in his hands. And Marx said, that's bullshit. And it's disempowering to people, and it makes them slaves to people with power who know better and aren't going to fall for that. So, if this is true, there's no rescue party on the way. It's you and it's me. So we need to get on with the urgent matter of engaging in the only struggle that really matters. which I will here articulate as the struggle for freedom, for our full humanity, and to take no substitutes for our full humanity. And this, of course, entails a long, involved conversation and debate, understanding what actually makes for human flourishing. We're not going to instantly agree on what makes for human flourishing. We're going to need to hash that out, as we have been doing. There's some people that we need to have involved in that conversation that maybe aren't in the conversation as present as they should be. Some of us are taking up too much space in that conversation, need to step back and listen. But we must engage that conversation. This is the bridge between atheism and humanism that everyone who's not a cynic or a nihilist must cross. And I use the word must there, because I don't see any other way. Like, you're either a cynic or a nihilist, and you literally don't care, which is fine. I see those people on Twitter all the time. Or at least they're playing those characters on Twitter. I don't know. Maybe they really do care, and they just are afraid to admit it. I don't know. But you either don't care or you do care, right? And if you do care, and God's not going to save us, then it literally is up to us to be involved in this struggle for our full humanity to be expressed and to be released from captivity. Our lives, I think, are lived in the tension between freedom and responsibility. In some moments and for some people, freedom is the greater mandate. At other times and for other people, responsibility is greater. But understanding this tension is vital if we're to live lives that make for human flourishing, both for ourselves and other sentient animals and the environments and institutions that we depend on. And what makes for human flourishing are the things that maximize freedom. The way we spend our time and other resources, the people who we enter into relationships of solidarity with, the causes that we engage in, ought to be informed by this calculus about freedom and responsibility. Taken together, this is what I like to call radical humanism. It is a love for life, unapologetically, including the things that living beings create: art, music, architecture, etc., the built environment, as well as the natural environment. But it is not, I use this word love cautiously, because it is not sentimentality. Radical humanism squarely faces the cruel and the ugly and the hateful. It looks fear in the face and does not back down, or it calls for backup from others that can take the reins. The love of life that radical humanism embraces is not a denial of reality, but a wholehearted embrace of reality in all of its beauty and tragedy. Radical humanism knows that there are no promises. No one is coming to save us. We are the ones that we're waiting for. And we will be damned if we're going to let people who wield the power ruin it for everyone else. Radical humanism is atheism in action. Radical humanism demands from us an analysis of our privilege. For some, radical humanism is an invitation to live into their freedom. For others, it is an invitation to a deep solidarity and responsibility with the whole human family, especially with what Franz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, and the earth itself. So this is my claim, and we can talk about it together in a minute here, that atheism means learning to live without promises, and consequently to respond to the calling of radical humanism, to live a life of love balanced between freedom and responsibility. Thank you. Sorry, that came off a little bit more like a formal speech, because I just wrote it. I tend to write things new, so that's a value add to you. I didn't just rehearse something. I've already written it. So I realize I've opened lots of cans of worms of various types, so let's talk.
Yeah, I have to decide which can of worms to open. I thought it was beautiful. I'm a little unconvinced, but really interested in being convinced that atheism is somehow an inherent positive claim. Seems like what you're saying, and you just clarify it, is that all humans have this sort of objective moral framework by which they make decisions, their own priorities, and that to be an atheist simply means that that isn't perverted by additional faith claims. Mm-hmm. Is that the claim?
Yeah, I mean, I think atheism is a void, right? Atheism is a lack. It's an absence. And into that absence, things. I mean, because, and the reason I started with Christian promises is that what's currently taking that place are Christian promises. And when you remove those, there's a sense of, and you get this all the time from people who are Christians when they find out that you're not a believer, like, well, how do you decide what's right and wrong, right? And so I'm not exactly saying that atheism is a positive claim. I'm just saying that in the absence of what was there, in a post-theistic sense, that it begs some other questions that have to be answered. I think it's not exactly the same, but it's unavoidable, the next question, the next set of questions.
Maybe it's just a claim that we're all humanists and that people that are religious are just kind of ignoring that piece of themselves.
Yeah, or somehow trying to engage Christianity with their humanism.
I think your understanding matches mine, what I went through when I was a devout Christian for many years and wound up an atheist, and this was one of the things that got me. But I think part of it is we're in a Christian culture that's predominantly Christian, so when we aren't Christian, there is a void, like, oh, there was this good thing, now there's not, and there's a void. It might not be true in communities or societies where there was no God to begin with.
Right.
You know? But what I wanted to say, there was that, but what I wanted to say was it was always on my mind, even when I was a Christian, and now even more so, that in a big way, Christianity, especially like evangelical or fundamentalism Christianity, is really nihilistic because like a conversation with a friend of mine a couple of years ago, she was really clear. She was like, oh, well, I was saved 5 years ago, and my mom died just a few months after I was saved, and I know she went to hell because she was a Jew, and I know she's in hell, but I'm just so happy because, Jesus is there for me, and I know that when I die, he'll wipe away my tears. And I was like, my God, you really believe that your mother is burning?
Yeah.
But it goes more than that, because it really, that particular form of Christianity that focuses on the issue of faith versus works, the only thing that matters then in somebody's life is their belief system, that they believe in Jesus or not. Nothing else they do say matters at all, which comes to like maybe 10% of all the billions of people who've ever lived. And I can't think of anything more nihilistic than saying, these people lived an entire lifespan, it didn't matter.
Right.
And now they're all like, burning in hell eternally. I mean, to me, that's like nihilism on fire, literally. I just can't think of anything worse.
Yeah.
So, and I think the bottom line with that is I think there's a sociopathic quality that one has to develop in order for that to be okay. Because someone like her, she's like happy all the time because she can't possibly be thinking about her mom, or all the other people she knows. So it's a real, I had at one time a psychological wall that you put up between you and everybody else so that you don't feel badly about that. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's really damaging.
Hey, Ryan.
Hi.
I know you're kind of coming at this from the atheism to the humanism, but I think maybe you've talked about on your podcast of there's a lot of humanists in the pews.
Right.
And there's another way to come at this same discussion is to kind of reinterpret some of the things that you said at the beginning, to take away that it's not some actual guy with a beard who has arms and is wrapping himself around us, but there's all this community, or those are just symbols for that.
Like
so
we're the arms.
Yeah, we are the arms.
We are the arms, the everlasting arm. But they're just not everlasting. That's the thing.
Right. So bring that same discussion. I don't know if you actually bring that to a church or how you actually do that, but I don't know. What do you think about that whole kind of reinterpreting the scriptures?
I used to do this thing with hymns in my sermons too, where I would look. One of my favorites was to look at the hymn that says, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up away beyond the blue." Versus, "This is my Father's world." And the idea that this is it right here. Now, of course, that doesn't go far enough either, but I think to me, what really kills it is the eternal part, the everlasting part. In other words, if the claim of Christianity is that nothing really can go wrong, right? That everything's going to be fine. And oddly, we get that same kind of message, although not quite so strongly, from some sort of overly optimistic humanists as well. that actually everything's getting better and it's probably going to be fine and everybody should just stop worrying. And my sense is that it's getting better because we're making it better, right? And that we need to keep engaging in that struggle. We're here?
Hi.
Hi.
This gentleman here, I was an atheist from the moment I was born, as far as I know. But I was raised in a Christian family, and 2 of us are atheists. I have a brother who's also an atheist. Mormons believe that you get to heaven, and you have to continue to work your way up in heaven. So this particular person who says her mom's in hell can't be happy, because some faiths you keep moving up in heaven, which blows my mind because I can't even imagine. I thought the concept was heaven or hell, and the concept that you're going to be punished is beyond me. But every time I'm approached that I'm going to hell, and I even had someone come and tell me my Catholic husband was going to hell because he wasn't a Southern Baptist.
Indeed.
And then I was told that my Methodist daughter, who was converting to Catholicism, was going to hell because she was joining a cult. And I'm very happy to say she's married to an atheist.
Right as we're getting to the next person, I know you didn't really ask a question, but I thought just in response, I feel like part of what I'm trying to say, and I may not have said it well, is that what I often feel like, and I got this when I was a Christian too, so you get together with Christians like this in a room almost exactly like this, on a day almost exactly like this, and we sort of congratulate ourselves that we're Christians, that we found the truth, and that we figured it all out. And then I gather with atheists, and we're just so proud of ourselves that we're atheists. We figured it out. We're like the smartest people in the world, right? And what I'm trying to say is that isn't anything, right? Like, that isn't anything unless you put it into action in a way that matters in the world. It doesn't matter that you figured out the answer to some simple question. And I'm saying this to myself as well. Like, it doesn't really, like, I get that it matters, so don't at me, but I get that it matters in the sense that religion corrupts our thinking about lots of issues, and that it matters that we just dispense with that magical thinking in order to be more rational people. But in the end, getting it right in your head is no different than getting it wrong in your like it has to affect the way you live your life, right? And so this is sort of, for me, like, if you want to go back to roots, for me this is like Aristotle, right? That we have to that we become moral people by acting morally and forming habits of morality in our lives. Then we're moral people. We don't become moral people by having moral ideas in our heads or whatever. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where I want to push back just a little bit. Next question.
I'm glad you clarified that a little more too, but all right. So in that hymn that you were quoting earlier, it made me think of the hymn Blessed Assurance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Another good one.
The same philosophy that I got the blessed assurance of heaven and life. So what your point is very poignant. Okay? There's a P and a P, an alliteration to throw to Sophia there. P and a P.
I feel the beginning of a poem.
No. When I was a Christian, I was sold on it. As
Yeah.
I just was talking before, I was completely sold on it. I mean,
Yep.
evangelizing, the whole shot, door to door. I mean, everything. You take people out, baptize them, the whole thing, go all the way in. Why? Because we got to make a difference. We can't just sit around, and also make a difference in the world. Volunteer at the soup kitchens. Help people out help the poor and all that stuff. So, so what your point is right on. So, the scripture I used to use it was faith without works is dead. And of course, got pushback from a lot of people saying you're saying you have to do work. Yeah, you have to, show your faith by your works. And so, same thing on this side.
Right.
When you talk about being a humanist, just having these philosophies isn't enough.
Right.
So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to reach those humanists in the pews? How do we do that with building a bridge across with?
Sure.
You have a religious belief. I don't, but we're humans.
Right.
We need to make this world a better place. How do we
Yeah,
do that?
no, I think that's a super good question, and I feel like, so I think Christians are caught in a double bind, and I was in that myself. So on the one hand, all of our theology is geared around this idea that everything is about the eternal and getting to heaven, even if that's not what we think all day, every day, there's still that underlying philosophy that the temporal, the secular, if you want to say, is the opposite of the sacred, right, which is elevated and above. But at the same time, those spiritual and religious people care about their kids, which is a contradiction, or their physical safety in a way, right? So, or their personal safety, or they care about the environment, which is a contradiction in a way, right? Because it's a dual loyalty. And I admire the dual loyalty because it means that they're struggling with the contradiction. And so I think that we should embrace people who do good for the weird reasons, or reasons that are not our reasons, right? I think that, interfaith cooperation is an example of this. And I know many humanist organizations around the country who are involved in interfaith. And I think the key to successful interfaith conversations is to get beyond sort of the kumbaya, like we all believe in something in common, and to say, okay, no, I'm going to stand in my distinctiveness, in my identity, in my separateness, in my uniqueness, but I'm also going to lean into this idea that we do have this common concern for humanity. And it's not simple, right? Because when we talk about freedom and responsibility, some people's freedom impinges on other people's freedom, or what they perceive to be their freedom, right? Their license, maybe. And so these are difficult conversations. And until we get to those difficult conversations, we have what Scott Peck called pseudo-community, like pretend community, where we like play that we like each other, and we have like nice little, time together. And we haven't gotten into anything like where we're like, okay, what you said to me really devalues me as a person. Like, let's talk about that, or like, I feel unheard in this setting, or I feel whatever it is. We have to get beyond some of those things. And I think engaging religious people around their humanity, around their humanism is great. That's how I ended up here, right? That's how I ended up here. I learned my social justice consciousness from Christianity and from Jesus specifically. I know that may sound crazy to a lot of you, but that's my path. And then I said, well, heaven sounds a little crazy. And besides, it disempowers people from acting in this life. They're all just worried about going to heaven. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, there's no heaven. I used to tell my congregation, if there is a heaven, there's nothing you can do about it. And if there isn't a heaven, there's still nothing you can do about it. So forget about it. If you end up there when you die, good. If you don't, you won't know the difference. So forget about heaven. It's just getting in the way of your thinking. And then it was, well, Jesus, the historical Jesus, yeah, probably a fraction, if that, of anything in the Bible was from a historical. So I kind of jettisoned a kind of historical Jesus that I wasn't too worried about it. I was just like, let's look at the teachings of Jesus. And eventually I was like, yeah, I don't know if there's a God and if it really even matters. And if God does exist, I doubt he would want us obsessing over his existence, right? So I picked someone said to me once on a podcast when I was doing Year Without God, what if you get to heaven and you find out you were wrong at the pearly gates? And I said, in my little imaginary scenario, God congratulates me for figuring it out and realizing that he was making it impossibly difficult to believe in him. And I win a prize or something, or I don't know. So, of course, that's my narcissistic view. I did good, So, but I actually think, if there was a God and he created us and he made us as smart as we are, which is not very smart, but still smart enough, that when we got to whatever finish line, that God would be like, well done. You used your head. It's a sick, twisted story, but I think we're almost out of time. Microphone. No, we want to respect people's ability to hear.
So you use the term radical humanism. I love that. But we had this discussion in one of our AHA meetings. We did a brief history of atheism, and we entered with the New Atheist movement. And during that time, they were throwing around words like militant atheism and fundamentalist atheism or radical atheism. And the idea is such that it kind of turns people off because it makes you seem like the very people that you despise, the ones who go out and evangelize and are annoying you, coming to your doorstep. Yeah, those kinds of people. So I guess, what is your take on that, considering you use the word radical humanism?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I'm not married to the term, and I really don't. I mean, I kind of care about it because I want to be specific in what I'm talking about, but I've had this idea in my head for a year and a half, and this is the first time I've said it out loud. So you're the first. But I feel like I want to use the word radical in the literal sense of at the root of it, right? And also in the sense of being radicalized. Because I think that right now, and I'm not sure how this goes over, if this gets heard by other people, but whatever. I was already fired from one institution. I feel like humanism has become a kind of middle-class bourgeois concern. You know, a kind of like being nice to your neighbor, but we don't want to like get into too many areas like, I had a whole thing that I wanted to talk about, and I was like, I don't know if I just want to like drop grenades and then say goodbye. So, but I think that there's too much apologia kind of going on in humanism. Too much like, well, we don't want to offend anyone, and I don't like offending people. I hate offending people. I hate getting into arguments. I don't like to argue in spite of what my Twitter feed looks like. I don't like it. It makes me physically uncomfortable. But I do it because I believe that people's freedom is important. And I can afford to be a little combative because I'm a white male with lots of privilege. And so that's something I can do. And maybe it's not the right thing, and I'll learn that it's not the right thing, and I'll stop. But for now, it feels like it's at least something I can do that's minimal while other people are on the front lines or whatever. I use radical in the sense that I want to kick humanism in the ass a little bit. Like, I want it to, like, come on. Like, the world is depending on the rest of us, all of us, whether we call ourselves humanists or not, like, doing something to, like, stop climate change from destroying the very environment that we necessarily involves critiques of capitalism. I'm sorry. Like, I don't make the rules. But it does. Like, you cannot have climate, reversing the effects of climate change and capitalism at the same time. Like, again, I don't make the rules. It's just, that's what's happening. We've extracted so much from the environment to satisfy our greed that now here we are. And I fear that we don't have the political will or the stomach to actually do something about it. And I think humanists should be on the front lines, just to pick one example. So, and I think I'm out of time now. Am I? Oh, no, that was a yellow card. I haven't been ejected from the game yet.
We have about 8 more minutes for questions.
It's just if I do it twice, then I think then I get ejected from the game. Yeah. Another, yes. Where's the mic? Yeah.
Yeah, you had said that, I guess, Christians or maybe other faiths just kind of focus on heaven, but it seems like there's plenty of historical examples like William Wilberforce or Martin Luther King Jr. Or the appeal to heaven flag that the revolutionaries were waving. That it seems like they think, hey, if we go ahead and do something, even though it seems like we're at a disadvantage, maybe God will come behind and help us. So sometimes doesn't it seem like they would do something that seems foolish that would be the right thing just because they expect something in the afterlife?
It's possible, yeah, and I think it's possible that they would do it in spite of the afterlife. In fact, I think a key example would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also had a thing to say about community as well, a book that you should read. It's very short, and you'll disagree with some of his religious things, but he understood what makes for actual community. And it's really the source for my notion that we have to realize that we're bound together, like our lives depend on each other, literally, in order to actually have that sense of community. And so, it's called Community. Yeah, it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, isn't it? Life Together. Sorry, yes, Life Together. Thanks, Bart. So, yes, and there's liberation theology. And what's interesting about these theologies is that they are so enlivening for people like me, and also very hard to arrive at for the average Christian. Because it takes you have to leave off a lot of textual evidence, and emphasize some other ones. But people do it, and they've done it. James Cone, the recently late James Cone, fantastic example. Cornel West. Our very own Anthony Pinn is somewhat of an expert in this area, has written quite a bit about liberation theology. And so I think that's an example. But I bring up Bonhoeffer because he was a pacifist who engaged in an attempt to assassinate Hitler, which seems like a contradiction. And he understood it as a contradiction. And to my reading, he understood that it would probably cost him his eternal life. And he did it anyway. Right? So that's what I call a humanist. And in his letters from prison, he wrote that he was in search of a kind of religionless Christianity. And nobody really knows what religionless Christianity means because he didn't live long enough to tell us what he meant, because he was killed in a firing squad because he was caught in the attempt to assassinate Hitler. And he was imprisoned for a period of time, wrote to his best friend a bunch of letters. And in those letters, he's just bemoaning the state of Christianity. And he says in those letters as well that he much preferred the company of his non-believing comrades than his Christian brothers and sisters most of the time. And he ends up, sacrificing his life for a cause that I think he probably, and I don't know for sure, but I think he suspects will cost him ultimately as well. So yes, there are Christians who are putting it all on the line and using their theological resources, which is what I was trying to do as well. And I don't mean to take anything away from those efforts. I think they're laudable.
Hi. Is it working? Okay. Well, when you just said he sacrificed his eternal life because he did what he thought was right, I just wonder how many people feel that if in a moment we could pretend that we all believe in Jesus' connection to God and connection to whatever. I had a woman at a school I taught with that was batshit crazy about Jesus, and I actually called her Jesus lady openly to the kids and everything. And she said to me, well, if you believed X, Y, Z, A, B, C, I said, you know what? If I believed, I would say no thank you to God. Because I'm not leaving my Jewish and Muslim and Buddhist and Hindi and atheist friends behind. Because that makes me a horrible person. That I would go off and live in La La Land with Sky Daddy, and then they would all be suffering in hell. So I just think that I wonder if other people think that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of, especially the Abrahamic faiths, are exclusive. It's one of the key problems with Abrahamic faiths, and I think the reason why they tend towards violence at times as well. But I think what the other gentleman was saying is that there are people who have recognized that about their tradition and have attempted to sort of transcend those realities. Like I left the church. On my last foot in the church I was essentially a universalist. I thought that all Christians, all people, would end up in paradise. And one of my big steps on the way out of the church was to say that St. Paul was wrong about same-sex attraction and love. And because I had been for years trying to spin a theology around how actually the Bible isn't against gays and lesbians and bisexual and trans and queer people. And then I was like, yeah, actually it is. It's actually a problem, yeah. And, if it takes a book this thick to explain this many verses, you probably have a problem. And so I was like, my only other recourse is to say that St. Paul was wrong about that. And if he were to be here today, he might change his mind, he might not, but it doesn't really matter what that pretend scenario is. And, for an evangelical, you can't say the Bible's wrong about that. That's not admitted. That's not allowed. In some traditions it is allowed. Like there are Episcopalians and Unitarian Universalists, and they're not really Christians, but there are Christians who will say, yeah, the Bible's a human document, and it's inspirational wisdom in places. And then, there's the place where the psalmist says, I wish I could bash the heads of little babies against the rocks of his enemies. And you're like, yeah, that's probably not a great idea. And so I was talking to someone else about the lectionary, and of course the lectionary conveniently avoids all of those verses. We don't want to read that one publicly in church because, that's hard to explain. So yeah, it's a big problem, and Christians find their ways around it, and some stay in the tradition because it provides meaning and, I guess, like emotional and I think you talked about mobilization, collective action. The thing I miss the most about being the pastor of a church is the sense of being able to mobilize people into kind of collective concern that we have. And that's why I think gatherings like this are important, and communities like on campuses are important, and in communities as well.
That is all the time we have. Thank you, Ryan.